Welcome to the next in our series of How Conversations, brought to you by the How Institute for Society. It's especially meaningful to welcome Darren Walker to this How Conversation, where together we will discuss the unique imperatives of a reshaped world, a world that operates differently and presents leadership imperatives and implications that are profoundly different than they used to be. Darren is the president of the Ford Foundation, a $13 billion international philanthropy. He's also on the boards of the Lincoln Center, the National Gallery of Art, the Carnegie Hall. Time has included Darren as one of the 100 most influential people. Welcome, Darren, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Dov. Looking forward to this.
So why don't we start? You and I speak often about the pause, and to echo Ralph Waldo Emerson, it's in the pause, as people, as humans, as leaders, that we hear the call. A lot's been going on in the world. There's a combustion of simultaneous crises, humanitarian crises, health crises, unemployment crises, racial injustice crises. They're all coming together. You have profound leadership responsibilities, but I know that in the midst of it all, you do find time to pause. Where are you? How have you been? I'm finding you in what state of mind right now, Darren?
I am in a state of mind of feeling very privileged. I think the reality, Dov, is that for most of us who are fortunate enough to lead organizations, to have some semblance of economic security, we're all doing fine. Our problems, while they may be problems or obstacles in our everyday life, are minor, are insignificant in the total scheme of things when we look at the problems of the world and the conditions that most people in our country are having to cope with. People like you and me have absolutely nothing to complain about.
So you said that because you're in a state of privilege and compared to those in the front lines and who've run to the front lines to save lives and those who have been so harmed and impacted, you've also said because of this privilege and the insulation that we enjoy, there's an opportunity, if not an obligation, to pause and redesign some of our lives and come out on the other side with a more clear sense of how we can make a more positive difference. Take us into your pause. What are you reimagining? What are you redesigning or recommitting to in this time?
Well, I have decided that, time and space is now organized through the prism of before COVID and in a post-COVID world. What will this new PC world be? And I think what I'm hoping is that, one, we realize first that the BC world is over. We are never going back to January of 2020. We are never going to live in that world again. That doesn't mean that our future will be dystopian, that we are headed for some apocalypse. It does mean, however, that we as leaders are going to have to rethink what leadership means, how we engage in the world, and the skills and tools and capabilities that we will need to successfully lead. And I believe that is going to present some tremendous challenges for leadership, because there's never been a time when it is more difficult and sometimes onerous to lead, because the systems within which we manage and lead are increasingly complex and demand of us more of our time, it seems, and are increasingly stressful. Stressful because of the velocity, the intensity of social media and technology, which if you are a leader, even in a decentralized organization, places tremendous pressure on you to respond, to stay ahead of, and it just adds stress. So one of the things that I think we leaders are going to have to do in this PC world is learn how to deal with stress.
And also have the empathy to understand that everybody else is trying to and struggling with stress. So there's a premium on empathy, on trying to really internalize the stress everybody else must be feeling.
This goes back to where you started and when we began this conversation, that everything that we are experiencing, we have to put into context. In order to put things into context as a leader, we need to possess the ability to contextualize.
Yeah.
That ability comes from, in part, empathy, compassion, a sense of humility, curiosity, and grace. These are not necessarily the skill set of leaders in a BC world, but in a PC world, it won't be an option. It's mandatory.
And these elevated qualities of character and human capacities weren't always thought of as strengths in the BC world. But I think you're saying that in the PC world, they're not only strengths, they're essential leadership skills and attributes to be able to lead. And Darren, since you talked about putting things in context and you've gone right to the topic of leadership, every year as president of the Ford Foundation, you write a letter where you're trying to explicitly frame the context in which the Ford Foundation aspires to make an impact. And last year, you redefined the Ford Foundation's focus and imperative as really pursuing philanthropy insofar as it yields a more just society and elevates justice in terms of its central focus. And I believe, and this year, in furtherance of that, you were very explicit. You dedicated your entire annual letter to the topic of leadership. And you actually titled it The Imperative of Moral Leadership. And you say moral leadership of all kinds in every movement and institution, organization, and community is a prerequisite of positive change. Speak a bit about some of the forces that you think are operating in the world and why they call for the leadership that you're describing, this imperative of moral leadership.
It's very challenging. The reality is you and I are capitalists. We believe that the best way to organize an economic system is through the mechanism of capitalism. The reality of this moment, this time we're living in, is that there is tremendous profit to be realized in fomenting division. There is tremendous money to be made in the business of hate.
Yeah.
And therefore, in a capitalist system, this intersection, the collision of democracy, morality, and capitalism, will capitalism win? I think without moral leadership, it is hard to imagine how the simply incentive structure of our system won't ensure that we lose. We lose our moral standing in the world. We lose our ability to, within our own country, to really be the voices that are needed at this time, because the incentives, whether these are the incentives in the political system or the incentives in the economic system, are propelling us to more division. They are rewarding those who would seek to divide. And so for those of us who believe that this really untenable dynamic of this binary construct of everything being black or white, like or dislike. If we don't intervene, I fear for our country. I fear for our nation. So to me, I think, you know, we're on a precipice in this country.
In many ways, just to echo back what I hear you say, I mean, I think you and I have talked about, you mentioned capitalism, for dynamic capitalism to flourish and be sustainable, for vibrant democracy, for healthy, strong communities and societies, they all have to rest on the twin pillars of shared truth and trust. And right now, both truths are being assaulted, and it's getting harder to share in them. And I'm not just talking about reality. Does a mask work or does a mask not work in terms as fighting against a coronavirus, but deep moral truths around equality and justice. Can we share in a conception of those? And if we can't share truths, then trust is eroded. So I think in many ways what you're saying is there's an imperative of moral leadership, because moral leaders are purveyors. They trust people with the truth, and they create virtuous cycles of more trust, because we're starting in shared truth.
And I think moral leaders, Dov, I believe moral leaders see themselves as part of something bigger than themselves. And I think that kind of thinking is inconsistent with the thinking of many leaders in this country today. I have seen leaders who say, you know, it's about the individual. It's about me and my leadership, my responsibility, my freedom. So we hear words that have great currency in contemporary culture, like individual rights, freedom. What we don't hear leaders talking about are community, our collective responsibilities to each other, service. And so I think part of it is we have to admit that, at least in my view, the cult of the individual crowds out the space for moral leadership, because I believe that we are a little too self-centered.
In your letter, and to this point, and I'd like to quote you, we are, as Lincoln suggested at Gettysburg, facing a great test. But with moral leadership, can and will pass it. With moral leadership, this can and will be a moment, in Lincoln's words, for a new birth of freedom, an opportunity to rebuild and be more perfect. And what's interesting is there's freedom from authority, from a micromanaging boss. You know, we know how to get freedom from. We cast off authorities and all the powers that, you know, hold us down and subjugate us. But the freedom in our Constitution is not freedom from, it's freedom to pursue happiness. It's a freedom to be yourself, to speak your mind, to pursue whatever religion and faith is in your heart. And we know that freedom from is created structurally, but freedom to is enabled through community of shared truths, through proper governance, through moral leadership. So is this really a time, therefore, to be on a journey of moral leadership that emphasizes and elevates all the ways in which we're in things together and all that we have in common?
Well, I think it is true. And I think in a multiracial, pluralistic society like the United States, this idea of we are all in this together is fraying. It's fraying because even in the midst of this pandemic, there are many people who say, well, yes, this pandemic is affecting our nation, but most of the people per capita who are dying are Black and brown. Mm-hmm. And so this really isn't affecting me. So I should be able to just go on about my business, because the people who are really being harmed by this aren't people like me.
Right.
And I think that kind of thinking is in some ways part of the challenge of building the kind of collective spirit that we need, and that and moral leaders have to be able to speak to this question of interdependency that some will say, well, but that doesn't relate to me, or that isn't as important for me, or it's going to be harmful for those people, those other people, but it's not really that harmful for me. How do we talk to our citizens, our workers, when that kind of thinking is the backdrop for many of the challenges that we face as a society? Well, if you live in Chicago, yes, there is a huge problem with shootings. But if you live on the North Shore of Chicago, you could live and not have any idea that in the same city, dozens of people are shot in a given week. And so the rules that might apply on the South side, really, they don't need to apply to us on the North side, because we're in a different world. And so how do we lead in those contexts? You know, how do we lead a workforce when we have thousands of workers, the workers who are African American, when you listen to their stories about policing, see a completely different experience than the workers who are white when they share their stories about policing, which are primarily positive.
Right.
How do you manage a workforce to come together when that workforce has such divergent experiences based on their race? I think moral leadership says we have to understand that we all believe that every person should have dignity, and that no one should feel treated differently. Right. And when that happens, it happens to all of us. This was Dr. King's message.
I'm confident saying that anybody that's been listening to you and will listen to you, is that's going to tune into this conversation, will be compelled by this imperative that something is, that PC, post-corona, we are forever changed. Our expectations of leaders are forever higher. There's going to be resonance. So I'd like to be a little bit more dynamic and bring out some of the impediments and challenges to being on this path of moral leadership. So let's get a little didactic. So let me throw the first at you. People hear the word moral and they go, well, whose morality? Why your morality? And you've made a distinction. We've talked about it between being moralistic and moralizing and moral leadership. So I just want you on the record to bring to life the distinction between moralistic and moralizing leadership and moral leadership. And then I'm going to take it from there.
Moral leadership is not moralizing. It's not didactic. It's not lecturing. It's not highly judgmental. Moral leadership is an understanding of a common way in which we want to be treated as human beings. It's a recognition in the idea of the dignity of all people. And it is a recognition that in a pluralistic society, we must continue to evolve, to include and be inclusive in the way in which we manage, we lead, we engage. And so for me, what moral leadership is about in this context is having courage. It is about having empathy.
Right.
It is managing in ways that demonstrate vulnerability, authenticity, being able to relate to others and their context, their situations.
Mm-hmm.
And so what it means for a university president, a public company CEO, a foundation president, is that we are in these positions where people look to us. They look to us for guidance. They look to us as examples of leaders, of managers. Are we inclusive? Do we make room for divergent viewpoints? Do we engage with empathy, with authenticity, with curiosity around whatever the problem? Are we patient?
Darren, it comes down to the how. Moralizing is about, I've got the right moral answer. Moral leaders look at the world through a moral lens. Is it fair? Is it just? Are these conversations one way or two way? Am I including or excluding? So it's really about all the hows that we've come together around. What is my relationship with authority? I know that you know that you know that I know that I pay your salary, so you're going to listen to me, or actually forget that. What's right based on our values and principles. So it's, and I think we're really trying to bring to life that moral leadership is really about what animates the leadership and what is it rooted in, values.
And it's not about, and it's not, as you have said so well, Dov, it's not about title. No. It's not about having your name at the top of the masthead. That does not make you a moral leader.
So I think we're talking about who occupies positions of formal authority at a time where more people are looking to those in charge. They're looking to governors and mayors of blue and red states to transcend political differences and show us that they can connect and collaborate and coordinate to put people above politics. And they're looking for CEOs to put people above profits now more than ever in that way.
And I think it's why, for example, there's been so much appreciation for Dr. Fauci and many of the public health leaders who have guided us during this pandemic. I find that the credibility they have with the public, based on all polls, is higher than any other category of leaders in this pandemic. And that says something, because they are speaking from the perspective of truth and facts, but there's a moral dimension to that. The moral dimension to that is that through bringing the evidence forward, people will make the right decisions. Yes. There is a sense that they don't need to be didactic, be moralizing, but present the evidence and the facts, and trust, and those leaders will be listened to.
What's also interesting is that these leaders often say that they don't know things.
It's a feature of moral leadership, where, as we've discussed, this idea of humility, of vulnerability, of uncertainty sometimes, and of being comfortable in that space. There are many leaders who feel that they must have all the answers, that they must stand at the top of the hill and lead the troops forward. But people actually want to be led by people who are authentic. And part of authenticity is vulnerability. Because if you are a human being, you actually don't have all the answers. And I think that curiosity is very important.
Indeed. And there's another dimension of moral leaders. Moral leaders recognize, as they look through the world through a moral lens, they see dilemmas. They sometimes see two bad choices. They see that the tension right now between saving lives and livelihoods really feels an inexorable pull in opposite directions. And moral leaders are honest about, we need to choose nonetheless, but both choices are painful. Darren, what's your experience? Because you've written and talked about nuance in a binary world, in a world of follow, unfollow, like, unlike. how do you enlist people in a journey where the path ahead is gray and full of nuance?
Well, Dov, let's start with the fact that I lead a foundation endowed by Henry Ford,
Right.
a notorious anti-Semite who in his lifetime did harm to Jewish people by spreading all sorts of tropes and inaccuracies and outright falsehoods. He also was a genius who transformed American capitalism.
Right.
And in the process was the first industrialist to name inequality as a problem and ensure that his workers were paid a wage that dignified their work and that allowed them to indeed buy the very products that they were making on the assembly line. I am able to hold both of those narratives, and that requires nuance. There are some who have said that, you know, the Henry Ford story is simply that he was an anti-Semite. That's it. There's nothing more worth knowing. And why do you even have his name on the foundation?
Right.
And there are others who say, why do you have to talk about that unpleasant stuff? He was the founder of modern American automobile manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. I don't agree with both of those, with either of those. Sorry, I don't agree with either of those. I think we must be able to hold the narratives, the dualities of the complexity of a man like Henry Ford. That doesn't mean that we need to put a statue up tomorrow of Henry Ford, but it does mean that we have to recognize that he played an indelible role in building this nation, and that he created a philanthropy that has done much good in the world.
If there were statues of Henry Ford in different places and people forget about putting one up, if there were a call to tear them down, what would you say?
I would say, no, you don't tear Henry Ford's statue down. You may contextualize the statue. You may look to the work of the Ford Foundation today and examine what it is doing to balance some of the things Henry Ford did. I think it's fair to say, you know, there's a lot that we're doing today that Henry Ford would never have imagined.
Right.
Beginning with the fact that a Black gay man is the president of the foundation that bears his name.
Right. And what's so important here is that we are living in a time where the statues are coming down. And I think that pausing to split hairs and make distinctions between a Confederate and a non-Confederate in the context of more racial awareness of both historic and modern day injustice matters. So I think part of what moral leaders do is they help bring in this type of perspective to wrestle and split hairs and make distinctions so that we can navigate the nuance.
And it's difficult because splitting hairs, I couldn't agree with you more that moral leaders have to bring nuance that requires you splitting hairs, requires really deeply interrogating a particular context so that you don't have just an automatic reflexive view on any given question, such as the statues. Yeah. But there are frameworks and there are constructs. You know, for me, the construct around the Confederacy, which is that it was an effort to destroy the United States of America, completely discredits anyone who would be a part of that effort. So I would not be in favor of raising a statue to any Confederate leader, because the enterprise was to destroy the United States of America.
what gives you hope? Because
What gives me hope? Sure. What gives me hope? Yes. Sure.
Talk about hope.
Yep. What gives me hope is seeing the young people in the streets of this country earlier this year joined hand in hand with older people, multiracial, multi-generational, across America, indeed across the world, from Boise, Idaho to Staten Island, all coming together, asking, demanding a country, a world of more fairness, of more justice, of less inequality, of less injustice. That's what gives me hope. And I am a firm believer, as we at the Ford Foundation like to say, we are in the business of hope. And hope is the oxygen of democracy.
Yeah. And Darren, and one more thing you've done recently, moral leaders also have the courage to ask the right questions. And you're a leader in a philanthropic context, and often in philanthropy, people ask this question, who should we give to and what we should give back? And you really had the courage to emphatically say, let's not ask what we should give back, but let's ask what we should give up.
Right.
And when somebody like you asks the question, what should we give up? That's a source of hope, because if people start giving up things, they create the room and the space for others to get to where they have gotten. So that's a source of hope, when leaders ask profoundly the right questions. And it's fair to say you've gotten quite a response to asking that question, right?
I have, and that is one of the reasons I have hope. But Dov, in closing, I have hope because of leaders like you and the work that you are doing at the Howe Institute, which I am delighted and greatly honored to be a part of. So thank you for having me today.
Darren, it's a genuine pleasure, and that we are in common cause, and that you are a founding board member of the Howe Institute for Society is a source of meaning and, for me, hope. And thank you, Darren, for elevating the conversation and enriching and enlightening so many. All the best.
Thank you, Dov.